This is the third talk in the series, Who Do You Think You Are? The subject is Moses, and the title is I Don't Know Who I Am, the Nowhere Man. I need to fill in a bit of Moses' life story before the event described in the reading, as by our standards he was not a young man by this time. He was close to 80 years old. But of course in those days people did live much longer. Something like 40 years earlier, Moses had fled from Egypt, where he'd been brought up, to Midian, which was on the southeastern side of the Sinai Peninsula. He had met the daughters of the priest Jethro soon after he arrived, when they were trying to water their father's flock of sheep at a well. Some male shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses came to their rescue and even watered their flock for them. He was welcomed by their father and agreed to stay there. He might as well. He had nowhere else to go. He later married one of those daughters, Zipporah, and they had 2 sons. Over the years he had become a shepherd and had taken the flock out into the desert and up to Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai. It was there that he had the miraculous experience related at the beginning of Exodus chapter 3, of the burning bush which did not burn away. Unbelievable. It was no wonder that he went closer to see what it was about. We are told it was an angel of the Lord that appeared to him in the flames, but it was God himself who called Moses by name from within the bush. His response was, "Here I am." He must have made a move to get closer, but God restrained him, saying, "Do not come closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses hid because he was afraid to look at God. Was this an inbuilt reaction or something he'd learned? At this point, I wonder how, or even if, Moses knew he was a Hebrew. He had been born at a time when the then Egyptian Pharaoh had commanded that all Hebrew boy babies were to be put to death at birth. Now we need to go back a bit further. Jacob and his family had gone to Egypt from Palestine many years beforehand, in a time of famine, because there was grain there that had been cleverly amassed by another Hebrew, who was in fact his estranged son Joseph, turned Egyptian official. The years had passed by, the Hebrews' numbers increased, and subsequent pharaohs had used them as cheap labour, and eventually made them slaves. But despite their hardship, their numbers kept increasing, and mass infanticide was considered the only solution. Moses' mother had managed to hide him away for about 3 months, and then placed him in a basket in the reeds at the side of the River Nile, hoping that he would survive. Her daughter stayed near and watched as the Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe in the river. The baby, whom the princess recognised as a Hebrew, was crying and she felt sorry for him. He was rescued from the water, and as he needed a wet nurse, his sister Miriam appeared and just happened to know one who was available, his mother. The princess even paid her to nurse him. There's provision for you. And when he was older, probably around 3 years of age, she took him to the princess, and he became her son. She named him Moses. He was now officially Egyptian and was brought up as a prince. Much later, when he was around 40, he went out to the area where the Hebrews lived and worked. He was appalled to see an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew, and after checking that there was no one else around, Moses killed him and hid his body in the sand. The next day he went there again and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" he asked the one in the wrong. The response was probably far from what Moses expected. "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses thought that no one knew what he'd done. But the Pharaoh found out and tried to kill him. That was why he had fled to Midian. So now we have Moses as an Egyptian prince turned refugee, a husband and father, and a shepherd, a long way from the place he knew as home. He's on a mountain in the desert with a burning bush that's speaking to him. What was he to make of it all? The Pharaoh he knew had long died, and the Hebrews' condition worsened. They cried out to God in their misery. The last verse in chapter 2 reads, "So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them." This was why God was speaking to Moses. He told him that he had seen the misery of his people in Egypt and heard their crying out because of the way they were being treated. So he had come to rescue them and take them to a land flowing with milk and honey, the land he had promised to Abraham and his descendants. This was Canaan, and unfortunately at that time it was occupied by a whole load of Ite nations. Then in verse 10, out of the blue, God says to Moses, "So go now. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses' reply was virtually, "Why me?" He panicked. Wouldn't you? He could reel off a whole load of reasons why not. Do we assume that he knew he was a Hebrew? If his mother had told him, would he have remembered? He was only a child when he was taken to Pharaoh's palace. Or did Pharaoh's daughter tell him? Why would she? We just don't know. Anyway, Moses was a Hebrew. But he'd been brought up as an Egyptian prince. He'd even killed an Egyptian and had to flee to Midian because he was a wanted man. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" was his not-so-polite answer to God. But God persisted, saying, "I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Thinking he had another good excuse, Moses said, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God's reply was, "I am who I am." This is what you were to say to the Israelites. "I am has sent me to you." Now, if Moses really knew anything about the Israelites, he would know how significant that was. When God had spoken to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he had referred to himself as the Lord, translated Yahweh. My Bible's notes tell me that the Hebrew word for the Lord sounds like I am. He was therefore to say that Yahweh, the Lord, had sent him. God went on to describe the precise manner in which he was to approach the Hebrew leaders. He told Moses that the Pharaoh would not agree to release the Hebrews until God had struck the Egyptians with all the wonders that he would perform among them. The Hebrews would even plunder the Egyptians of silver, gold, and clothing that they would give them to get rid of them. Moses came up with another excuse as to why he wasn't the right man for the job. What if the Hebrews didn't believe him? God gave him 2 signs to convince them: turning his staff into a snake and back again, and making his hand leprous and restoring it. If those miracles didn't work, then he was to take water from the river Nile pour it on dry ground, and it would become blood. Moses was now backpedaling fast. He said to God, "O Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." I think God's patience was beginning to run out. He said, "Who gave man his mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you to speak and will teach you what to say." Moses' final plea was, "O Lord, please send someone else to do it." This made God angry. He does not withhold his anger or punishment from his disobedient children forever. Moses would experience this many years later. You'd think that by now, I suspect this conversation must have taken place over a period of time, not just by the burning bush, that God meant business. God's patient answer to Moses' final excuse was, "What about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you, speak and teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth, and as if you were God to him." So Moses would be God's mouth, and Aaron would be Moses' mouth. At last, Moses agreed. He took his wife and family back to Egypt, and he and Aaron went and spoke to the Pharaoh. But it took a long time for the Hebrews to be released, and 40 more years of wandering in the desert before they entered the promised land. Moses had many identities in his lifetime: son of immigrant slaves, prince of Egypt, Midianite shepherd, leader of Hebrews. But it was the last one that was so important. He had eventually found his true identity in God, and therefore his purpose in life. He did become the strong leader of the nation that he is remembered for, their ruler and judge, as had been said about him all those years before. God had plans for the Hebrews. If Moses had not listened to God and finally obeyed him, would the Israelites have escaped Egypt and ended up in their promised land? There was a cost, though. Sadly, neither he nor Aaron would set foot in Canaan, because on the journey there they had each been disobedient to the Lord. But that's another story. So where are you with God? Do you feel you're getting nowhere? 2 weeks ago, Lorraine showed us 7 slides of I am statements, all biblical quotes, to encourage us to find our identity in him. It took me a long time, 20 years after recommitting my life to Jesus, to train as a reader, now known as a licensed lay minister. I had 2 sons to bring up. At one point John was very ill, and later his mum developed dementia and needed care. I was very active in my church, but knew inside that God was calling me to something more. Perhaps I needed to learn more and deepen my faith. Thank goodness I wasn't quite wandering in the desert like the Israelites. But I did have a very understanding vicar who encouraged me, and I know that God got me in the right time slot to do my training. 1 year either side, and I wouldn't have stuck to it. How do we find our identity in God? First, talk to him. Not intercessory prayer for other people or events, but have a real one-to-one conversation. Tell him what you think, how you feel, and listen. He will speak to you. He often uses other people, situations, or just the beauty and creativity of nature to say things to us. Some people do actually hear a voice. Read the Bible. Yes, a lot of it's difficult to get your head round, but there are plenty of books to help with that. Better still, do it with someone else, socially distanced, of course, so you can talk it over between you. Or use daily reading notes. They take us through chunks of the Bible at a time, give explanations, and encourage us to think for ourselves. Above all, don't be like Moses and think up all sorts of excuses why not to do anything. Don't forget, God knows you better than you know yourself, and he has a plan for all of us. In Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 11, he says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Amen.